Okay, sorry, took a little break there. Anyway, chapter 29, the final chapter, a slow descent into sanity. Having cleaned up from her walk in the woods, Jody sat next to Vera Miller in one of the many rocking chairs that had been strategically placed around the porch to provide privacy. Waiting for her family to return, the women made small talk like two old friends. Their conversation had no real direction, yet within the hour they'd spoken, Jody got the feeling Vera Miller had delved into her life without ever having asked a direct question. It didn't feel intrusive, but comforting. It felt the woman had a true interest in her. Hearing the car approach, Jody stood up and went to the rail of the porch. As the car came to a stop, she watched her girls exit the car in a flurry of noise and excitement. Forcing a smile across her lips, she addressed each one of them as they approached. "Hi, Dayla. Did you have fun?" "Yeah. What did you do?" "Stuff." "Like what?" "Just stuff." "Okay. Can I have a hug then?" "Not now, Mom. Daddy bought me a new dress for tonight. I want to put it on." She ran past her mother and let the screen door slam behind her, her footsteps echoing through the house as she ran up the stairs to their rented room. Jody flinched as the door slammed. To hide her embarrassment as Vera Miller watched, she tried to defend her daughter. "I guess she's excited about her new dress. Teenagers, right?" Turning quickly away as Lexi came up the stairs toward her, Jody said cheerfully, "Hi, honey. Did you have a good day?" "I suppose." "What did you do?" "Went to some museum and walked around town." "Did you go anywhere special for lunch?" Slowing her pace up the porch steps, Lexi answered the question snappishly. "No, Mom, I didn't have anything special for lunch. Did you?" With a direct look into her mother's eyes, as if challenging her to a duel, she brushed rudely past her and followed her sister into the B&B. Jody dropped her head, sucking in a painful gasp of air. With her eyes closed, she held the air in her lungs until the pain screamed at her to exhale. Hoping Mrs. Miller hadn't heard Lexi's rudeness, Jody risked a glance up through the bangs that hung in front of her eyes. Vera Miller sat rocking in her chair looking at Jody with a stoic expression. As Jody dropped her eyes again, Audra ran past her in a rush. Thankful for the interruption, she turned quickly to her oldest daughter, who continued down the opposite side of the porch away from where Mrs. Miller sat. Audra, where are you going?" Jody yelled after her. "I have to call Travis," Audra said. "It's almost 4 there, and I told him I'd call him by 2 Minnesota time. My phone died, and I gotta reach him before he leaves for work." "Oh, I'm sorry, it's almost 4 here," she said. "And I told him I'd call him by 2 Minnesota time." Audra's unthinking admission had Jody straightening her back as she watched her daughter's head toward a small parlor at the farthest end of the house. "Can you excuse me, Mrs. Miller? I think I'll go see about my daughter." Mrs. Miller nodded and switched her attention to Doug, who had gotten out of the car and was walking slowly toward the house. Mrs. Miller stood up and walked to the far end of the porch as if the most important thing in life at that moment was to straighten the cushions in the other rockers and pluck dead flowers from hanging baskets. At the far corner, hidden in the shadow of the eave, she turned to watch him. Having been preoccupied with folding a local informational brochure, Doug had sat in the car until he had gotten it the way he wanted it. Because of his need for order, his slow departure from the car had him missing the comments of each of his daughters to their mother. Vera Miller watched him stop a moment and stare in the direction of his wife. Upon seeing Jody go after Audra, he shook his head in 2 sharp jerks from side to side and said something inaudible through clenched teeth. He then continued on into the house without seeing the proprietress of the B&B as she faded deeper into the shadows. Jody stepped into the parlor as Audra dialed the phone. "Audra, can you put the phone down, please? I want to talk to you." "Not now. I have to get hold of Travis." "That's what I want to talk to you about." "Mom, please, this doesn't concern you." "It very much concerns me. I thought you had broken it off with Travis." "Please, Mom, not now. He's going to be so mad if he doesn't get my call." "Is this really how you want to live, Audra, being afraid of Travis with every mistake you make?" "I told you, he's changed. He hasn't touched me since we got back together." "And you think he will never touch you again? You remember what Tony said, abusers don't just stop." I told you Travis has changed. Besides, what would you know about it? Daddy never raised a hand to you. In fact, he's never even raised his voice to you. What? Audra's comment made Jody's mind go temporarily blank from buried memories. Dark and forbidden thoughts began to slither to the surface of her mind like a virus. I said, Audra reiterated, you're married to someone who wouldn't hurt a fly. You know nothing about it. Like a door of brilliant light opening inside her soul, Jody's life came into sharp focus in the split second it took for Audra's comment to penetrate the substance of her existence. Her entire life had been boiled down to one fine moment. No one knew. Jody stood in a shocked stillness, letting the truth wash over her. No one knew. The words kept repeating themselves in her head. Her daughters didn't know. Her sisters didn't know. Her parents didn't know, or didn't care if they did. The revelation made it hard for her to breathe. Staring at her daughter, Jody watched as Audra's impatience with the phone made her fidget with worry. She had done this to her, Jody realized. She had made her daughter a replica of herself. Awareness hit her hard as virus poisoned her blood with the truth. Trying desperately to draw in air, Jody let it sink in that Audra was right in one way, that Doug had never raised his hands to her. Instead, he used harsh insults and cruel words, said in secret and behind closed doors to hurt her, eventually breaking her down into a weak and submissive puddle, cowering in fear of his disapproval, just like her daughter was doing. Watching Audra pace with fear of Travis's possible reprimand, Jody thought with self-hatred how her daughter was wrong about one thing. She herself did know about abuse. She had done this to Audra, to all of them, she thought with a shameful heart. She had taught them it was all right to be in a submissive position as long as the person they loved was happy. Their needs, their wants, their happiness didn't matter. Her head felt like a vice was squeezing her temples as blood seemed to drop from her chest to her feet, draining the life from her. This was the legacy she would leave her girls. Stark realization effaced her life and withered basic hope. Audra's words came at her like a scalpel slicing the wider the wounds of her truth. I'm sorry, Mom, but you really wouldn't understand, and I'm not a little girl anymore. I think I know what I'm doing. Audra, Jody said, trying desperately to regain her focus, her mind racing faster than words as she expertly hid her feelings behind the mask of complacency she had been taught to master. There are other ways you can be hurt other than just physically. Having turned her back to her mother, Audra continued to ignore what was being said as the phone rang on the other end. I don't need you to protect me anymore, Mom, Audra said distractedly. Come on, come on, come on, she muttered under her breath to the phone, urging it to connect. Audra, please listen to me. Maternal instinct had fought through the blackness of her self-awareness, and she reached for the button on the phone to end the call. As quickly as Jody's maternal determination burned through her self-disgust, Audra quickly snuffed the flame. Mom, stop, Audra scolded, grabbing her mother's wrist before she could end the connection. I'm not your little girl anymore. In a couple of weeks, I'll be going off to college, and I have to learn to do things my way. I'm sorry, she said as a distant ringing of the phone changed to a muffled hello. Travis, just a second. Audra interrupted herself, releasing Jody's wrist and covering the mouthpiece with her right hand. Mom, I have to take this. Please, just leave me alone. I'm a grown woman now. I don't need you anymore. Turning her back to her mother, Audra answered the call. Travis? Yeah, I can talk. No, it was just my mom. I know. I'm sorry I'm late, but it's only a few minutes. Please don't be mad. Jody withdrew her hand as the final stab of Audra's words punctured her heart. So this was it. Her daughter had made her choice. Because of my weakness, Jody said to herself, it's too late to save my child. She let the poison right up and burst through her skin. I did this. Backing out of the room, she stumbled through the door, her skin tingling. The familiar anxiety started at her feet and grew until the panic settled in her chest. Her breathing became erratic, her skin clammy. She felt herself disappearing, shrinking down into the splinters at her feet to become one with the burnished wooden floor. Bent over at the waist, she waited for the earth to swallow her. Taking great gulps of air, somewhere in this distance, she could hear Doug yelling impatiently. Girls, hurry up, and we're going to be late for the ferry. Jody, get Audra off the phone and get in the car. Jody stood at the rail of the boardwalk, watching tourists pass below her on the beach. At her back, the dock bore the pounding feet of vacationers as the sharp screech of hungry gulls sounded overhead while the sun simultaneously heated the top of her head. In front of her, the occasional scrape of moored boats fought the ocean wind, knocking them against the dock. Below her, she watched the waves wash away footprints of the people from the wet, impressionable sand, as if the owners were nothing more than mere apparitions. It amazed her how easily they could be swept away. They strolled by so carefree, unaware their very existence was disappearing behind them. It was surreal as she watched small, quiet waves rush back and forth to shore, erasing these vulnerable creatures. Alive, dead, alive, dead. They are so vibrant, she thought, yet their lives can be taken away so effortlessly, just like her son's. Life was so out of perspective. A young boy below her caught her attention when he squealed in delight at having found a shell. She watched him pick it up and hold it to his ear as wonder crossed his face. She knew he could hear the hollowness of the wind inside it, but like her, it was vacuous, spiraling down into an endless cavern of empty regrets. Jody, Doug snapped, "Pay attention. Here's your ticket." He thrust a small rectangular piece of paper into Jody's limp palm. She looked at him, but recognition was slow in coming, the texture of the paper in her hand unfamiliar and odd. Ignoring the emptiness behind her eyes, he continued, "I'm going to go round up the girls. The ferry leaves in 10 minutes. I'm giving you 5 to be on it. Do you understand?" As if the whole world obeyed him, the horn of the ferry reinforced his order, blasting loudly with his final word as he turned away. Following his command like the good wife she'd been molded to be, she mingled with the crowd across the dock and onto the rocking sway of the ferry as Doug disappeared into a nearby store. Controlled by the mass, she allowed herself to be pushed past the gate onto the deck of the ferry. Obediently following the lead of the other passengers, she absent-mindedly handed her ticket to a deckhand who punched it and handed it back, never looking up at the faces passing by him. Jody walked slowly down the length of the ferry, past a large enclosed passenger cabin that had held rows of benches and tables, a snack bar, and the restrooms until she reached the bow. Dropping down onto a metal box that read "Life Jackets" in large red letters, she leaned against the shadowed wall below the window of the bridge. The metal box was cold through her thin slacks. A chill skidded up her spine but went unnoticed as she pulled the hood of her jacket up over her head to block the sun from her eyes. The boat rocked gently, lulling her into a rare complacency. Leaning her head back against the self-worn paint of the cabin, she closed her eyes. Minutes later, she heard the soft scraping of the boat as it pulled away from the dock. People milled around, talking loudly against the breeze that blew their words out to sea, taking pictures and roaming the ferry in a rush of excitement. Jody sat quietly with a detached air of solitude, waiting for her family to cross her path so she could join them in their illusion of a happy vacationing family. After several moments, like an animal sensing its offspring, she looked up to the upper deck. Seeing Lexi and Dayla leaning over the rail, Jody saw Lexi pointing to a spot in the distance and heard her over the din of the crowd. "Look out there. I think I see a whale. Where's Mom? She should see this." Jody's heart jumped with a small midget of hope as she raised her hand to yell up in answer. Before her words could make it past the hopefulness in her throat, Doug gave a quick flick of his arm as if ridding himself of unwanted trash, dismissing Lexi's question, and diverted the girl's attention with, "Forget about your mom for now and just enjoy the scenery." Jody's hopefulness turned once again into her familiar feeling of worthlessness as she watched her family disappear from the rail above her. Over the ferry's loudspeaker, the captain welcomed his guest aboard the Blue Mermaid ferry. The trip, he explained, was half an hour to the indigenous island of the Lumi tribe. With a short history lesson of the region, he then gave instructions that the Lumi Heritage Center closed at 9 and the last ferry back to the mainland left at 9:15 sharp. Whoever wasn't on board at that time would have to wait until morning. He finished with a practiced thrill in his voice. "And keep your eyes peeled, folks. It's migration season for the whales, so I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see some on this trip. We have calm waters today, so everyone sit back and enjoy the ride." 10 minutes passed as Jody waited for her family to find her. Resigning herself to the fact that they weren't looking for her, she gathered her strength to go and find them. Rising, she walked along the waist-high bulwark, down the starboard side of the ferry, passing people without really seeing them. Her fellow passengers, intent on their own goals, ignored her. She felt invisible. Reaching the stern of the ferry, she stood a moment and stared at the water below her, the airy clouds above her. She became transfixed by the small fishing boats angling for distant islands. There was one small boat that seemed to be following the blue mermaid, like a duckling after its mother. Becoming slightly sick from watching the bow of the boat jump with each wave, Jody turned her attention to the water beneath her and its mysterious darkness. Letting the depth of the ocean overtake her, she stood transfixed. The sun, sinking warmly at her side, reflected rays across the water as droplets sprayed the surface and turned them into liquid glitter. Letting her mind slip into that world where peace abounded, she once again saw fairies where light should have been. She watched as the sun filtered between the waves, lapping against the hull, breaking up the water while the forward motion of the ferry drove the iridescent creatures farther out to sea. Worried she would lose them, panic started rising in her as she followed the thousands of flickering lights with her eyes as they rode the waves and bobbed teasingly, reaching for her. A strong urge to join them overtook her, making her ache. The need for serenity lured her deeper and deeper into its silent depth, each descending wave ripping reality along its bias with slow, consistent tears. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice again, "we have whales off the port side. We'll be stopping the boat so they can pass. If everyone will look to your left, you'll be able to see them as they breach." The sudden thrill of excitement coming from the other passengers escaped Jody as the ferry came to a slow stop. She continued to stare into the water as the boat listed slightly to one side from the frantic movement of people scampering to port like excited mice. Ignoring the thought of seeing the majestic animals, Jody stood transfixed, feeling a pull she couldn't explain. It was there, she knew, in the deep darkness below, the tranquility she so desperately needed. The fairies vibrated on the surface of the water as if telling her it was okay. It was her time. Without taking her eyes from their sparkling presence, she quietly lifted herself up on the rail and swung one leg over the side. Straddling the 6-inch piece of wood, she let the natural sway of the boat rock her like a child's rocking horse. Taking a moment to look up at the horizon one last time, she ignored the little duckling fishing boat quickly coming up behind with its friendly waiting passengers, and casually lowered herself over the side. Being on the starboard side, the ferry rose higher above the water, giving her added coverage as her body hung down. Clinging onto the rail by her fingertips, the natural weight of her body stretched down until her feet dangled into the water. Feeling freedom, she calmly let go and slid quietly into the coldness of the ocean without a splash. The frigid water sucked the breath momentarily from her lungs, but bobbing up like a cork, she arched onto her back and spread her arms like Christ on the cross. Jesus had sacrificed for her sins, she reasoned. She could do no less for her own children. Giving a slight push on the hull with her feet, she glided gently away from the ferry. Looking up at the sky, she let the beauty of the shadow-laced clouds lull her into a sleepless calm. Ignoring the icy water soaking through to her skin and dragging heavily at her clothes, she accepted the waves lapping at her face and chest as a form of baptism that purified her life of self-perceived sins. The sin of letting her son die, her incompetence as a mother, the love she once held in her heart for Archer, her subconscious hatred for her father, her contempt for Doug. All these were truths and her failures she never allowed herself to acknowledge, yet now bombarded her with clear precision as each wave swept over her and cleansed her. The coldness burrowed stingingly into her pores, setting her spirit free while a leisurely acceptance of the truth licked the edges of her tormenting guilt. A slow rumble sounded under the water echoing against her ears as the ferry restarted its engines and slowly started moving again. its wake pushing her farther and farther away from its safety. With a clarity born of despair, the need to surrender overtook her. Telling herself it would all be over if she just took a long, cold drink of water. She marveled at the simplicity of it. Releasing the breath from her lungs, like she were kissing the wind, she let her body relax and sunk slowly under until the water engulfed her. Beneath the surface, she could just make out the blurred images above, the bright blue sky, the sparkles of the sun on the water. In her mind's eye, she could see her family as they sailed away, Doug garnering attention from other passengers, befriending them with his wit and charm, yet oblivious to her whereabouts. Dayla craving her father's approval at her own detriment. Lexi slowly letting herself starve in some sort of rebellion that even she didn't understand. Audra on the cusp of womanhood, focused on a young man who was so much like her father it was frightening. For the first time in Jodi's life, she could see it all so plainly, as water didn't blur the images of life but made them clear as glass. The water surrounded her as she continued to sink, her mind racing with past memories and current truths. Her lungs began to scream for air as she let herself settle toward the bottom in a synchronized rhythm of colors that bounced off the surface above. One simple sip was all she needed, but she continued to hold her breath. She finally closed her eyes against the glitter of the fairies swimming on the surface. She was at death's door. The door was still closed, but she was close enough to it to see the blackness of its surface, feel the roughness of its texture. The feeling was like none she'd ever had, smooth ebony with a tangible yearning that made her want to reach out and grab the handle and open the door. As she descended closer and closer to the final turn of the handle, memories played over and over, disjointed in their speed, frigid in her mind. Above her, as she heard the high whine of a fishing boat's engine. Opening her eyes, she watched a shadow pass over her, blocking out the filtered sun. In a blink the fairies were gone. Only a cold darkness remained, a darkness that suddenly frightened her in its perpetuity. As she descended deeper into the unforgiving Pacific, her thoughts continued to clear. For the first time in her life, things began to make sense. The water was actually washing away the pain of her insanity, so she could finally breathe over the intensity of it. But breathing was something she couldn't do as she sank deeper and deeper with greater and greater speed. All at once, the reason for her being came into focus. Her daughters, life, living. Clarity struck her thoughts as fast as a lightning bolt. What am I doing? She thought with long-forgotten lucidity. How can I leave my girls to the likes of men like Doug and my father? As reasoning filtered into her nightmare, she realized she wanted to live. Startled, she drew her knees toward her until she was upright underneath the water and started clawing for the surface. Panic blurred her reasoning and the art of swimming escaping her. Flailing, her clothes tangled around her, pulling her down faster, the ocean refusing to give up its bounty. No, her mind screamed, I can't let this happen. Not now. I have to live. I have to survive. She tried climbing the watery walls with frightened enlightenment, frustrated as it glided through her desperate fingers like silk on silk. She clawed and kicked, trying to reach the surface. She was so deep, her clothes so heavy, her lungs so exhausted. Her mind silently screamed for help as her lungs burned for air. With one final desperate push, she stretched her arm up and kicked viciously. There, above her, life. She could feel it. As her fingertips pushed past the cover of her approaching grave into the open air, her starving lungs prematurely anticipated the taste of oxygen and gulped greedily. In shock, water began pouring down her throat, freezing her lungs. Her body reversed its position and started sinking again. Hopelessness swarmed her as water filled her body. With an acceptance learned from a life of strict obedience, she relinquished to the inevitable. With one arm still raised above her in a natural pose of helplessness, she sank. With despair smothering her lungs, she watched through half-dead eyes a hand reach below the surface, grappling for her own outstretched offering. Convinced it was the hand of God, she relaxed her into languid repose, giving in to salvation. The icy ocean settled inside her body like a rock as it slowly drowned her sluggish mind. Death watched her eyes flutter as it pulled simultaneously at her feet. Above her, God's mighty hand played tug-of-war with her arm. She could feel their strength in equal measure and relinquished her fate to them. Letting her eyes close, along with her starving lungs, a strange warmth overtook the cold inside her as she relished sleep. Before death could claim her entirely, the last of her mind was semi-aware of God giving her arm one last hard pull. No, not God, but someone. Someone was pulling hard on her arm. But the suction from her body's weight and the heaviness of the ocean above her was only serving to force the water deeper into her throat. As life raced through her mind and quickly lulled her into the drone of darkness, a wisp of a final thought escaped her mind as she was finally jerked into unconsciousness. So this is sanity. Epilogue. Saving Jody just wasn't out of compassion, it was out of fairness. After everything that had been taken away from her, someone had to give her something back. It took a long time for her to open up about her life with Doug and to accept that her father's cruelty wasn't her fault. But even with all the verbal and emotional abuses these two men doled out to her over the years, it was Audra telling her she was no longer needed that finally broke her. After Bill Miller pulled her from the ocean that day, he and Vera hid her from the authorities by moving her to friends who specialized in special cases of abuse. Then they nursed her through the breakdown that had been lurking under the surface for months. Tony watched over the Warrens' children from a distance, as a promise she'd made to herself. After Travis had put Audra in the hospital again, Tony was finally able to convince her to file charges. Doug could no longer ignore anything was happening, but by blaming Jody for overreacting, he had to face it head on. He was by her side when she went to court against Travis. That was one thing in his favor. Lexi's anorexia got worse until she ended up in the hospital under supervision and counseling. It's not anything that will ever go away for her, and she battles it daily, blaming the demons that took away her mom. Dayla had to grow up fast when Doug no longer took the time to coddle her against the self-perceived unfairness of her mother. Like it had been a perverse game to thwart Jody, he grew wary of Dayla's whining. Dayla had to give up, too. It took a very long time, but she eventually grieved for her mother, tiptoed around her father, and matured. Archer. Well, Archer just stopped hanging out with Doug at all. Doug had prodded him several times saying he needed a friend, but Archer slowly slid away. He was seen giving interviews after a hockey game once in a while, but there was something missing. Kind of a deadness behind his eyes. As for Doug, Jody's disappearance garnered him pity and the attention he always craved. He dated often and a lot, but he came to realize that it was Jody who had kept him grounded. At least that's what he told anyone who would listen. In reality, something he never admitted to himself. With Jody gone, there was no one to blame for his failures, no one to control, no challenges, and a life without challenges turned into an empty life. And Jody, for months her sanity floated in and out of existence like autumn leaves tossed in a storm. She had wanted to hide from herself, from life, from God. Unknowingly, she had found a way. But one day, when no one is expecting it, the clouds of self-persecution will part, and she will walk through them to be stronger than she's ever been. And she will emerge to show everyone a bright, secure individual. She will return to Minnesota to collect her daughters, turn and walk away with a courage to never look back, and walk onward in freedom, the kind of freedom that will give her an inner light even the fairies will envy. And on that day, she will finally be able to say, "At last, I'm free." The end. Thank you for listening. I know it's a dark story. I hope it wasn't too depressing. Like I said, I dedicate this to my mom, and I'm just so happy you listened to it. Thank you. I do hope you enjoyed it, though. And again, I apologize for all my flubbing up of the words and the sentences, and you being patient enough to sit and listen through it. Thank you. Bye.